Thank you very much. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here this evening. When the little boy said that the emperor was naked, he wasn't telling anyone anything they didn't already know. But he added to their knowledge nonetheless. By blurting out what every onlooker could see within earshot of the others, he ensured that they now knew that everyone else knew that everyone knew that, and so on. And that changed their relationship with the emperor from obsequious deference to ridicule and scorn. Hans Christian Andersen's immortal story draws on a momentous logical distinction. With private knowledge, I know something, and you know it. With common knowledge, I know that fact, and you know it, but in addition, I know that you know it, and you know that I know it. On top of that, I know that you know that I know that you know it, and so on ad infinitum. Now, this matters because common knowledge is necessary for coordination. In a classic example from the economist Thomas Schelling, a couple gets separated in New York, incommunicado, and somehow must find each other. Suppose he knows that she likes to browse in a certain bookstore, so he heads there, but then realizes that she will predict that he will go to a camera store, so he changes course and heads there, until he figures out that she will anticipate that he will guess that she will opt for the bookstore, so he does another about-face, only for it to dawn on him that it will occur to her that he knows that she is aware that he likes to haunt the camera store, so he pirouettes once again. Meanwhile, she is whipsawed by the same futile empathy. Nothing short of common knowledge can guarantee that they'll end up in the same place at the same time. Now, of course, people can't literally think an infinite chain of I know that she knows thoughts, what cognitive psychologists call recursive mentalizing. Mentalizing being the attempt to get in someone else's head, recursive mentalizing being the attempt to get into someone else's head while they're trying to get into someone else's head who's trying to get into someone else's head. Our heads start to spin with 3 or 4 layers, let alone an infinite number, as in a well-known episode of the situation comedy Friends, brought up to me many times, which I'll reproduce for you here.
They don't know that we know they know we know. And Joey, you can't say anything.
Couldn't if I wanted to.
I couldn't if I wanted to. Our heads start to spin with a 2 or 3 levels, let alone an infinite number. Instead, common knowledge can be captured in a simple mental state, the intuition that something is self-evident or public or out there. And that can be conveyed through direct speech, in the case of our New York couple, a cell phone call. Indeed, solving coordination dilemmas may be the reason our species evolved language in the first place. Now, the next best thing to a public event is common salience or a focal point. Schelling suggests that the separated couple might go to the big clock at Grand Central Station at noon, even if it wasn't particularly close to where they had been separated, simply because each knew it was likely to pop out in the mind of the other. A third solution is a convention, a tacit agreement among people to do things in a certain way for no other reason than that they agreed to do it that way, which is reason enough. Our New York couple might agree that if they're ever separated again, they'll adopt the convention of chivalry and go to the bookstore, or patriarchy and meet at the camera store, or whimsy and meet at the lost and found of a department store, or fairness and flip a coin or take turns. On larger scales, focal points and conventions drive our legal and financial coordination. An everyday example is driving on the right. Or on the left, it doesn't matter as long as everyone agrees to drive on the same side. As in a joke where a woman calls her husband during his morning commute and says, "Be careful, honey, I've been listening to the radio and they say there's a maniac driving on the wrong side of the freeway." He says, "One maniac, there are hundreds of them." Another obvious example is currency, where I accept a piece of paper in exchange for an old couch because I know my grocer will accept it in exchange for some food because he knows his suppliers will accept it, and so on. Now, not all the examples are that obvious. Why are autocrats terrified of public protests? The basic reason was explained by Gandhi in the eponymous movie. 100,000 Englishmen cannot control 350 million Indians if the Indians refuse to cooperate. But all those Indians can't refuse to cooperate if each one fears that no one else will join him. In a public demonstration, each protester can not only see the others, but see the others sing the others. And this common knowledge can allow them to coordinate their resistance, whether by literally storming the palace or by bringing the machinery of the state to a halt through work stoppages and boycotts. This is the basis for an old joke from the Soviet Union, but a man standing in Red Square handing out leaflets. Well, of course, the KGB arrest him, take him back to headquarters, only to discover that the leaflets are blank sheets of paper. They confront him, "What is the meaning of this?" And he says, "What's there to say? It's so obvious." The point of the joke is the man was generating subversive common knowledge. Anyone accepting the leaflets now knew that they weren't the only one with a grievance against the government. Moreover, since he was doing it in a public place, everyone knew that everyone else who was accepting the leaflet now knew that the others knew it as well. And in a case of life imitating a joke, in recent years, Russian police have arrested several people for, yes, carrying blank signs. Another not-so-obvious example is from finance. John Maynard Keynes compared professional investment to a newspaper beauty contest in which the goal is not to choose the prettiest face, as in the old Miss Rheingold beer ads, but the face that is chosen by the most other competitors, each of whom is anticipating the choice of the other competitors, anticipating the same thing. So speculative investors buy securities not because of their productive value, say investing in a factory that sets up machinery to turn out widgets which they sell at a profit that the shareholder then partakes in, but because they hope they can unload them at a profit on other investors, greater fools, and so on. So this means that exuberant cycles of recursive mentalizing can be set off by a conspicuous focal point, like a Super Bowl ad. Everyone knows that everyone watches the Super Bowl, and that everyone knows that. In 2022, cryptocurrency exchanges ran high-concept ads that tried to gin up a common expectation of rising prices, not by touting any advantages of crypto, such as you can buy drugs with them or weapons, but by warning, don't be like Larry, don't miss out. Of course, it's only so long that an asset can levitate in midair, suspended by nothing but common expectation. Bubbles pop when a market starts running out of the greater fools who don't want to miss out, or when a reason for doubt itself becomes common knowledge. That can send investors running for the exits, each desperate to sell the asset out of fear that others are selling it out. The result can be a bank run, a hyperinflation, or a depression. When Franklin Delano Roosevelt said, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself," it was not a feel-good bromide, but a theorem of common knowledge. With investors always on the lookout for focal points, economic leaders must be wordsmiths, mystics, and occasionally comedians. Alan Greenspan once said, "Since I've become a central banker, I've learned to mumble with great incoherence. If I seem unduly clear to you, you must have misunderstood what I said." And after Jimmy Carter told his inflation czar, Alfred Kahn, never to use the self-fulfilling word depression, he said, "We're in danger of having the worst banana in 45 years. My own interest in common knowledge comes from its role in everyday life. Social relationships are coordination games. Two people are friends, or lovers, or allies, or dominant and subordinate, or transactional partners, because each knows that the other knows they are. These understandings are cemented by a number of common knowledge generators, like eye contact, where you're looking at the part of the person that's looking at the part of you that's looking at the part of them, and so on. Or blushing, where you feel the heat of your face reddening from the inside, knowing that your onlookers are seeing it from the outside. Or laughter, where a conspicuous noise exposes the common assumptions held by everyone who gets the joke. Conversely, when we don't want to upend a relationship, we take steps to avoid the common knowledge that would undermine it. We avoid looking someone in the eye, or ignore the elephant in the room, or mumble with great incoherence. This explains why people don't blurt out what they mean in so many words, but veil their intentions in euphemism and innuendo. There's the classic sexual come on, would you like to come up and see my etchings? Which by the 1930s was so familiar that James Thurber could draw a New Yorker cartoon in which the hapless man says to his date, "You wait here and I'll bring the etchings down." In the following century, I have been told etchings have become Netflix and chill. People also veil their bribes, as in, "Gee, officer, is there some way we can settle the ticket here?" And their threats, as in, "We're so glad a guy like you is on the jury of the Soprano trial. Hardworking guy, wife and kids, performing a civic duty we should all take part in. We know you'll do the right thing." A veiled threat. Now, the point of an innuendo is not to provide plausible deniability. These euphemisms don't pass the giggle test, but deniability of common knowledge. So if Harry says, "Want to come up for Netflix and chill?" and Sally says no, then Sally knows she's turned down an overture, and Harry knows she's turned down an overture. But does Sally know that Harry knows? She could think, well, maybe Harry thinks I'm naive. And does Harry know that Sally knows that he knows? He could think, well, maybe Sally thinks I'm dense. With no common knowledge, they can maintain the fiction of a platonic friendship. But if Harry had said, "Would you like to come up and have sex?" then Harry knows that Sally knows that Harry knows that Sally knows, and they cannot maintain the fiction of a friendship. That's what lies behind the feeling that with barefaced speech, you can't take it back. It's out there. The logic of coordination and common knowledge explains why we deplore all the hypocrisy and white lies and rituals of social relationships, but would not want to live without them, as dystopian comedies like Liar, Liar play out. Our relationships are cemented by commonly accepted creeds of unstinting generosity and loyalty. Privately, we know they're fictions, but making the rude realities common knowledge would pollute the pool of assumptions that allow us to get along. We also have to get along with people in less intimate relationships, and here we rely on norms. Rules for living together that aren't written down by lawmakers or enforced by the police, but exist because everyone knows that everyone knows they exist. In everyday social life, basic civility depends on the norms that people don't brazenly lie or insult each other or prosecute personal vendettas. In the anarchic global order, peace depends on the norms that states are immortal, national borders are sacrosanct, conquest unacceptable, nuclear weapons unthinkable. Because these norms are propped up by nothing but common acceptance, they can implode when they're openly flouted, even when there's loose talk about flouting them. These are some of the topics that I raise in the book When Everyone Knows That Everyone Knows. I'm just going to run through a list of other puzzling phenomena on scales large and small, from couples to the global order, that I think can be illuminated by the role of common knowledge in human coordination. I'll run through them, and if anyone is curious, you can ask me about them in the Q&A. I will then single out one of them and say some words about research that I have done on the topic, with particular relevance of the setting this evening. So, for example, the difference between CC and BCC in email etiquette. Why saying "I love you" is such a momentous step in the development of a relationship. Why people hoard toilet paper during pandemics and other emergencies. What's the deal behind cancel culture? What do we mean by saving face? Why is there such a thing as political momentum during the primary season? What does it mean to give someone the hairy eyeball? Why do we get absorbed in murder mysteries? Why are bystanders often apathetic in the face of an emergency? What do we mean by deplatforming? Why do we hold ceremonies? Why do we have strategic ambiguity? What about long goodbyes? What my grandmother called klamkatak, from the Yiddish word for doorknob. That is, conversations with one hand on the doorknob at the end of a dinner date. Agreeing to disagree, according to a famous theorem which celebrates its 50th anniversary this year from the Israeli mathematician and Nobel laureate Robert Aumann, rational agents with the same understanding of the world who share their assessments of the world cannot agree to disagree. Pissing contests, the expression "don't go there." I'm shocked to find that gambling is going on in this establishment. That is mock outrage. White lies, living in the closet, coming out of the closet, passing for white. Gaffes in Washington, which Michael Kinsley defined as when a politician says something that's true. And attributions of righteousness, and that's what I will turn to for the last part of my presentation this evening. Particularly relevant for the Jewish Community Center because my own exposure to states of mutual knowledge came when I was a student in Temple Beth Shalom in Montreal. And I learned about states of mutual knowledge from the great medieval Jewish philosopher Maimonides, Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon, acronym Rambam. And according to Maimonides, the charitable giving, the righteousness of an act of charitable giving, of tzedakah, a word which is ambiguous between charity and righteousness, does not depend only on the magnitude of the gift, but on the states of knowledge between the donor and the beneficiary. So in his ladder, I'll give you 5 of his 8 levels. We can talk about the others later if anyone is curious. The highest level of tzedakah, of righteousness, of charity, is a gift that allows the beneficiary to escape the need for charity altogether. Teach a man to fish, and you feed him for a lifetime. Give him a starter loan. Go into partnership in a new business. That is the best form of charity of all, and no one would disagree with that. But the next level down is what we would today call a double-blind donation, where the beneficiary doesn't know the identity of the donor or vice versa. And Maimonides said that in the ancient temple in Jerusalem, there was a kind of community chest where the better off members could leave food or gold, go away, and then poor people could retrieve them, neither knowing the identity of the other. That is the one level down. One level down from that is when the donor is anonymous, but the beneficiary is known to him. So he imagined a situation in which a wealthy person would leave a package with food or with coins on the doorstep of a poor person, scamper away, the poor person would open his door the next morning, and there it would be. So the donor would know the beneficiary, but not vice versa. One rung down from that is the converse, and Maimonides, among other things, a logician, was very good at mapping out all the logical possibilities. So this is a case where the donor is known to the beneficiary, but not vice versa. So he said the great sages would walk around with gold coins in the back of their robes, and the poor person would kind of scamper behind them and pick out the robes, so the poor person would know who gave him the coins, the rich person would not know who took them. And the lowest, worst form, least righteous form of charity is a public donation. The rich person puts the coin in the hand of the poor person, the situation that we have been talking about, namely common knowledge. So common knowledge is the least charitable form of giving. Now, at the time, I, being an 11-year-old boy, and kids love to point out the hypocrisy of their elders, put up my hand and said, well, if the least righteous form of giving is publicly acknowledged donations, how come here in our own Temple Beth Shalom, every fixture, every pew has a little brass plaque saying which member of the congregation donated the money? My teacher kind of had to shrug and say, well, we never live up to our highest ideals. Decades later, I returned to thinking about this situation thanks to the work of another great Jewish thinker, Larry David, who had a famous episode in Curb Your Enthusiasm, in which Larry David donates money for the wing of a non-profit building and is acknowledged with a plaque that says, "Wing donated by Larry David." He looks and he sees that the other wing is donated by anonymous, and everyone is chatting about this wonderful person who gave the money for the wing anonymously, but it leaks out that the identity of anonymous was Larry David's arch rival, Ted Danson. And Danson gets the credit not only for the gift, but for the anonymity, despite paradoxically his identity being known. And Larry, needless to say, is quite miffed by that. He said, "I didn't know that you could be anonymous and tell everyone. I would have taken that option, okay?" So we esteem anonymous donors, even though it has nothing to do with how many people are fed, how many poor people get to live a more comfortable life. Why should it matter who knows what? Indeed, there's something of a paradox. One might think that publicizing a donation should incentivize future donors, which means there are actually more benefits to more poor people. And of course, this being an area of rabbinical pronouncement, it was inevitable that some other rabbi would disagree. And indeed, another medieval rabbi, Rabbi Shlomo ben Avraham, the Rashba, argued to the contrary, that there is a mitzvah lefarsem, a duty or a benefit in publicizing, precisely because when you spread the word of a good deed, others will step in seeking that glory, that koved, as we might say, and more poor people will benefit. Nonetheless, that doesn't seem to be the way we think, as is shown by Maimonides' ladder and the Curb Your Enthusiasm episode. So this led me to ask two questions as an experimental psychologist. First of all, do people today agree with Maimonides? Is it true that common knowledge donations, that is, the identity of each being known to the other and that being known, is perceived as less charitable than double-blind and anonymous donations? And if so, why? So here's a hypothesis, that attributions of charitability are assessments of the person's dispositional generosity as a potential reciprocation partner. That is, when we perceive acts of charity, we try to look into the person's soul and see how much they are motivated to help people out of the goodness of their heart with no expectation of any ulterior benefit, such as reputation or payback. And the idea is that a common knowledge donor, remember this is the least righteous form of charity, he could call in the favor later, and he could be doing it to burnish his reputation, whereas a double-blind donor must be doing it purely out of the goodness of his heart. Unless, like Ted Danson, he manages to get the word out, in which case he gets the double benefit of the anonymity and the reputation. So here's what we did, we being some graduate students and postdoctoral fellows, Julian DeFreitas, Peter DeScioli, and Kyle Thomas. So we had people imagine a situation where Ashbourne is a small town where everyone knows each other. One year, a dozen houses were flooded. A townsperson collected donations to help the affected families. Because the families all knew each other, he offered donors several ways to give. Double-blind, neither knows the identity of the other. The donor gets a photo of the family that he benefited. The beneficiary gets a photo of the donor who benefited them, or they exchange photos, and each knows that they exchanged photos. So, and then we had them fill out a number of rating scales. So, of different donors who donated under different circumstances of mutual knowledge. So, for example, Brian donated $50 to the charity and chose option 2, and then people were asked to rate how genuinely charitable do you think Brian is, and how likely do you think it is that Brian will consistently give to others in need in the future. And I'm an experimental psychologist, and we always like to present data, so I'm going to present some data, but starting with the prediction from Maimonides' ladder of tzedakah. Maimonides would predict that the a double-blind donation would be judged as the most charitable, followed by the donor receiving a photo of the recipient, followed by the recipient receiving a photo of the donor, followed by exchanging photos. Now, this is the theoretical prediction. If Maimonides was here, this is how he would predict the experiment would turn out, assuming, of course, that our respondents had the same intuitions as Maimonides himself. So here's what we found for the first three conditions, the three rungs on the ladder. People behaved as Maimonides would have predicted, but when it came to the common knowledge condition, indeed the one that we were most interested in, there it was more or less a tie, if anything a little bit more righteous than just sending the photo of the donor. So contra Maimonides, common knowledge is not seen as the least charitable way of giving. Now, if I put it to you, just to imagine the circumstances, say, that Maimonides himself outlined, maybe you could have a bit of an intuition as to why Maimonides, though a brilliant physician, theologian, philosopher, astronomer, was a wee bit off in his psychology. So imagine the situation of the rich person wearing a robe with coins in the back. Now we can think of, say, wearing an open backpack, and the poor person kind of scampering behind him and picking up the coins. So that's supposed to be better than the donor putting the coins in the hand of the beneficiary. But our subjects didn't quite agree. If anything, they thought it was a little bit better if in the common knowledge case. Well, I think you might feel that there's something a little bit kind of demeaning about following a rich person and picking coins out of his backpack. So it suggests that there's a second factor in attributions of charitability, namely the social relationship between the donor and the beneficiary. A truly generous donor avoids any sign of conspicuous superiority over a beneficiary. That is, kind of, marching around with money in your robes, and a poor person, picking it out. It's a little bit kind of demeaning. A common knowledge gift, even though not as charitable as a double-blind gift, still establishes something of a relationship of social equity between the donor and the beneficiary. That's what we hypothesized that Maimonides didn't quite take into account. Now, so far, that's just a story. Is there any evidence to support it? So we ran another study in which we got an additional set of ratings in the same circumstances. We wanted to tease apart the motive of reciprocity, in particularly foregoing any chance of reciprocity if you are anonymous, and that earns you some brownie points in the ladder of tzedakah. To assess that, we asked our subjects, how much do you think Brian was motivated by a desire to improve his reputation with the family and to improve his reputation with the broader community? These being things that would take you down a few notches. And indeed, with these ratings, Maimonides got it 4 out of 4 times. Indeed, when it comes to the ulterior motive, Maimonides' concern reflected in the rungs of the ladder from double-blind to revealed donor to revealed beneficiary to common knowledge follows exactly the order that he predicted. So judgments of reciprocity do follow Maimonides' ladder. Then we also wanted to get independent assays of the tension between the social relationship of equality between donor and beneficiary versus a sense of superiority. So we asked people directly, do you think that Brian sees himself as equal in status to the family or as higher in status? And here we got the reversal for the common knowledge condition that would explain why the common knowledge was not considered least charitable. Namely, with sending a photo of the donor, that is, the donor exposes himself, the recipient doesn't, that is seen as the most haughty, the most superior, and people, we think, dinged the donor who would give under circumstances of appearing to be superior. So this tension between the desire to forego reputation or possibility for payback and the desire to establish a relationship as equals, we think explains the contrast between Maimonides' intuition and ours today. And it also underscores the mixed blessing of a common knowledge gift. It is, that is, the donor and the beneficiary know each other, each knows that the other knows that the other knows. It does establish a social relationship between the donor and beneficiary, and is an example of how common knowledge establishes social relationships, but with a possible obligation to repay, which is not always a good thing. If I can allude to one more example of popular culture that exemplifies this phenomenon, and I should add, by the way, that a lot of our mysteries, our comedies, our dramas play out the characters' knowledge about each other's knowledge about each other's knowledge. So it's not a coincidence that fiction, that situation comedies, that mysteries are so rife with examples of common knowledge. So here's one more that illustrates the possible pitfalls of an obligation to repay. The opening scene of The Godfather, where Don Corleone is beseeched by a member of the community to do him a favor. And after tormenting him, watching him sweat and twist for a while, Don Corleone grants him the favor, but says, "Someday, and that day may never come, I'll call upon you to do a service for me. But until that day, accept this justice as a gift on my daughter's wedding day." So you really don't want to be in debt to the Godfather. And that is a reason that common knowledge of a gift can be seen as less righteous than an anonymous or double-blind gift. So I'll stop there, and I'll take some questions perhaps about the list of everyday phenomena that I think can be illuminated by common knowledge, or anything else that occurs to people. Okay, Enlightenment Now, that is a book that I published in 2018, made a great case for social progress in all categories except climate. Post-COVID, Trump, and AI, are you still optimistic about continued progress? So I'm often, this is a frequently asked question, and I have to emphasize that the book Enlightenment Now and a book that I published 7 years before that called The Better Angels of Our Nature, Why Violence Has Declined, were not really cases for optimism, although they're often interpreted that way. Those books presented more than 100 graphs plotting measures of human well-being over time and showing that, contrary to many people's impressions, just about anything that you can measure about human well-being has improved. That is, compared to our ancestors, we kill each other less, fewer people are killed in wars, fewer people die of starvation, fewer babies die in childbirth, fewer mothers die in childbirth. The world has become more democratic. Measure after measure, the human life has improved when measured quantitatively. Now, the reason that comes as a surprise to people is that if you get your view of the world and of progress from the headlines, things will always seem worse and worse, because headlines report things that happen, and things that happen are usually bad, because it's easier for something to go wrong suddenly than to go right suddenly. So if there's a war, if there's an earthquake, if there's a disaster, you can be sure to read about it. Good things, in contrast, tend not to make the news. They're either things that don't happen, like there hasn't been a war in Southeast Asia for almost 50 years, something that would have been shockingly utopian in my teenage years, or things that build up a few percentage points at a time and compound, changing the world by stealth, but never happening suddenly on a Thursday morning. So, for example, the economist Max Roser notes that the papers could have had the headline, 130,000 people escaped from extreme poverty yesterday, every day for the last 30 years. But they never ran that headline, and as a result, 1 billion people escaped from extreme poverty, and no one knows about it. So the case in Enlightenment Now wasn't a case for looking at the bright side or seeing the glass as half full. It's just look at the data rather than the headlines, and your understanding of progress radically changes. You see how much progress there's been. Just to take one example, for most of human history, life expectancy at birth was about 30 years. Today, it is more than 70 years worldwide, more than 80 years in the developed world. So not only do we have extra life, but we have an extra life. It's as if we were all given two lives. But again, many people are blasé about this. They just don't stop to think about it. So that was the point of the book. But in response to another frequently asked question, so does that mean you believe in progress? I tend to give the answer from yet another great Jewish thinker, Fran Lebowitz, who once said at an event that I did with her in New York, "I don't believe in anything you have to believe in." So progress is not a force. It's not an inevitability. It's not an arc. It's not the way that history necessarily goes. It's the result of people recognizing problems, trying to solve them, retaining the solutions that work, trying not to repeat our mistakes, which means that there's no reason to expect that it would be continuous, and indeed it isn't. Indeed, in the curves that I plotted, even back in 2018, none of them just go straight up. There are always kinks, blips, sometimes sickening reversals. And so that brings us to the present. What's the deal in the 7 years since Enlightenment Now was published, which means the 8 or 9 or even 10 years since the data that were available when I submitted the manuscript. So for some of the measures, after a dip because of COVID, progress has resumed, and we are currently at a all-time historical record. So that's true of life expectancy, which of course took a dip during COVID, but now we're higher than we were before COVID. It's true of extreme poverty, that fewer people are in poverty than at any point in human history. It's true of education, access to electricity, access to clean water, and many other indicators. For some, though, there has been a drooping or a reversal. This is true of indexes of democracy. We're still way better than we were at any point in the 20th century when, as the older members of the audience will remember, and the younger members will have been told, half of Europe was behind the Iron Curtain. Spain and Portugal were literally fascist dictatorships. Greece was under the control of a military junta. All of South America was under the control of right-wing military governments. South Korea, Taiwan were military dictatorships, all of them democratic today. However, there has been, we are not at the peak. We have shaved off about 20 years of progress. We're back at the level that we were around 2005. So the curve has gone down. We're going in the wrong direction. Whether it will completely reverse the progress that we've seen since the 1950s is something that's very hard to predict. When it comes to war deaths, there's also gone in the wrong direction. And again, the curve for war deaths has its ups and downs. We're currently in an up phase because of the wars in Ukraine, in Gaza, in Sudan, in Ethiopia. Still not as bad as we were in the 20th century, but the last few years have gone in the wrong direction. And this is, again, what it's to be expected that there will be reversals. Whether it will wipe out the progress or will go back is something that we just don't know. A few more. Very good. When does common knowledge transition into common sense? And why do we split drastically? This is a good question. So I should add that common knowledge in the sense that I've been using it is not exactly the same as the way we use it in ordinary conversation, where we usually talk about common knowledge as something that everyone knows. And in the sense from philosophy, from game theory, from economics that I've been using, it doesn't refer to just something that everyone knows, but crucially something that everyone knows that everyone knows. And one reaction might be, well, yeah, what's the big deal? Everyone knows that there's a difference between blurting something out and keeping it private. Isn't common knowledge just common sense? So I have a chapter in the book called Common Knowledge and Common Sense, where I present several findings from the technical literature in common knowledge that I try to explain as clearly as I can, though they are a bit technical, which show that the difference between private and common knowledge can actually challenge common sense and lead to some surprising conclusions. I won't walk you through them, but I'll just mention what they are. One of them is what's sometimes called the world's hardest logic problem, which I present in my own version, which is how can you tell when you have spinach in your teeth if you don't have a mirror and everyone is too polite to say that anyone else has spinach in their teeth? And there's a well-known logic puzzle that works through that, and it crucially hinges on the difference between common knowledge and private knowledge. So it's a challenge to the idea that, well, we knew this all along. There's another one that I alluded to a few minutes ago, the Robert Aumann's theorem that rational agents with the same understanding of the world, who then pool their conclusions, though when they do that, their conclusions have to be the same. In other words, rational agents may not agree to disagree. Now, that's surprising. You might think that agreeing to disagree is a mark of civil discourse. In fact, according to Aumann, that would be irrational, at least under the assumptions that he laid out in his theorem. And a third is, I defined common knowledge not just as I know that you know, and you know that I know that you know, but there has to be an infinite number of levels. That is, even 17 is not enough to guarantee common knowledge. Now, that's surprising. That's not common sense. And I do my best to explain the theorem that shows that any finite number is not enough. I also, in each of these, since I didn't want to just have a chapter with math problems, I show that even though, as with any theorem, it's you're bound by the artificial toy world that the mathematician sets up, I argue that each one of them, these results, does have implications for the role of common knowledge in everyday life. In the case of not agreeing to disagree, for example, we might have the intuition that when two people disagree and they're both jointly seeking to determine the truth, that is, they're not in an ego contest, they're not trying to win an Oxford-style debate, but they're just in a collective enterprise to find out the way the world works. How did the SARS-CoV-2 virus originate? Who killed John F. Kennedy, and so on. We have an intuition that reasonable people may start off with different opinions and then gradually meet somewhere in the middle. Isn't that what reasonable people do? But when you think about it, why should the truth just happen to lie halfway in between, two people who are in an argument? And what Aumann, an implication of his proof, is that rational argumentation should not be like bargaining. That you might even flip positions as you exchange your posteriors, your assessment of the world. You might both go in the same direction before suddenly lurching, that there should be no predictability to a rational argument until agreement is reached. And it kind of sets, and moreover, that the surprise is I should not treat my evidence as any more worthy than your evidence just because I'm me and you're not. Not if we're both rational. I shouldn't care whether you came up with it or I came up with it. We should just pool our knowledge. Anyway, that's an example of a moral for everyday life. In this case, how should people disagree? That is inspired by by a surprising theorem. Okay, please elaborate on cancel culture and bystander apathy. So, cancel culture, it's something that I have a separate interest in as something of an activist for academic freedom. I co-founded the Council on Academic Freedom at Harvard to push back against academic cancel culture. Thank you. That is, why should people be censored, punished, disinvited, deplatformed for their opinions? Aren't we, if we're in a truth-seeking profession like journalism, history, science, scholarship, law, government records, someone might be mistaken, but they shouldn't be punished because of the content of their opinion. The only way we fallible humans can approach the truth is if someone voices an opinion and everyone else gets to say what's wrong with it. Those opinions that survive attempts at falsification are the ones that we tentatively accept as true. If you disable that process by shutting someone up, by punishing them, then we're guaranteed to be locked into error. So that's my interest coming to it, why I think academic freedom and more generally freedom of speech are good things. But in the book, I don't try to prosecute that war. What I do is look at it from the point of view of a psychologist as to why is there an urge to cancel in the first place? Why do we feel a moral imperative to shut someone up rather than simply show why they are mistaken? And what does it have to do with common knowledge? So I think I argue that there are two phenomena at play, two psychological phenomena. One of them is that most people, most of the time, don't think of opinions as just assessments of the state of the world. They're perceived as forms of self-expression. What kind of person are you? Are you a good person or a bad person? Do you have beliefs that help with unity of the tribe or the coalition, that express the right moral values, that are uplifting, that are inspiring to children? The notion that big ideas like what's the cause of fortune and misfortune, why are there depressions, why are there wars, where did Homo sapiens emerge from, the idea that you can actually get answers to those are novelties that are kind of dividends of the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution, but that aren't natural human intuitions. For most of our history as a species, no one knew and you couldn't find out. So your opinions may as well be expressions of your moral character, since there was no truth of the matter that could be ascertained. It's only with scientific method, historical records, norms of trying to approach the truth that we have any right to think that these questions are answerable at all. And of course, that's what academia ought to be about, similar to respectable journalism, courts of law, and so on. But still, people's intuition is that what you believe is a reflection of what kind of person you are. So sometimes people hear opinions and they think that is a bad thing to hypothesize. Not that it's factually incorrect, but you must be a bad person if you think that. Now, what does this have to do with common knowledge? Well, here's the second part of the explanation. I mentioned before that norms are held in place by common knowledge. What is a norm? Such as, in contrast to when I was a kid, you don't, in public forums, you don't tell ethnic jokes anymore. You don't have ethnic stereotypes. You don't expose certain body parts in public. You don't insult someone's appearance to their face. Well, they exist only if people know that other people know they exist. It's not like they're enforceable by the police, which means that if someone breaches them in the arena of common knowledge, that is, they flout the norm and everyone can see them flouting the norm and seeing everyone else flout the norm, there's a danger that the norm will cease to exist because it only existed through the common knowledge that people don't do that. And that gives rise to an urge to safeguard the norm, to prevent it from unraveling by punishing the violator, again, in the arena of common knowledge, punishing them in a place that everyone can see them being punished and see everyone else see them being punished. Now, it used to be that criminal punishments worked that way. We had public hangings and public beheadings and the pillories and the stocks where someone was humiliated in the town square so everyone could see that the person was being humiliated. Now we can generate the same thing, especially with social media, where you can pile on and there can be a shaming mob. And the temptation is to do that to punish some opinion that is felt to challenge some important moral norm. And I give an example of a story that biologists like to tell. I fact-checked it, and it turns out it's apocryphal. It never happened, but it's a favorite story of biologists and scientists in general, that in the 19th century, the wife of a vicar, upon learning of Darwin's theory of natural selection, exclaimed, "Descended from apes, my dear, let us hope it is not true, and if it is true, let us hope it not become widely known." So if she had said, let's hope it not become commonly known, that would have been, that is the explanation of shaming mobs and cancel culture that I advanced. Bystander apathy, I'll try to be brief. This is a staple of the undergraduate psychology curriculum, inspired by at least what was thought to be a real-life event, the murder of Kitty Genovese in the mid-1960s, where, according to a report from the New York Times, a young single woman was stabbed to death in an apartment courtyard. 31 people witnessed it, and no one called the police. So this was seen as the ultimate sign of modern urban apathy and anomie and alienation, and there was a lot of hand-wringing, what kind of society have we become? Now, to the credit of the New York Times, they actually did a follow-up decades later, and they found that this was complete bunkum, that in fact, several people did call the police, and one of them cradled Kitty Genovese in her arms until an ambulance came. So it was one of these cases of a story that had too much moral value to be actually true. Nonetheless, there is a real phenomenon of bystander apathy that is in a group. Often everyone will hope that someone else will respond, as when maybe a scream goes up in the middle of the night, and you wake up and then you go back to sleep, figuring if it was something serious, someone else would have called the police. People walk by a desperate homeless person. So there is a phenomenon of bystander apathy, and the question is, what is the explanation? In particular, and how it was explored experimentally by social psychologists, they showed that when it really wasn't apathy, it was diffusion. That is, if there was a single person witnessing an emergency, they would almost always help. If there were multiple people, then often people would be apathetic. No one would step into the breach. And these are a number of ingenious experiments where people would be filling out a questionnaire, thinking that was the point of the experiment, and there'd be anguished screams coming from the next room. If there was one person, they'd go out to see what was going on. If there were like 5 of them, they'd continue to fill out the questionnaire. That's the phenomenon. So is it really apathy? We, following a game theorist who analyzed the situation, hypothesized that it was what is called the bystander's dilemma, the volunteer's dilemma, I'm sorry. So if there are several people who witness a need for help, since there is some risk of intervening, I mean, not just the time and the effort, but you might be exposing yourself to danger. Still, you're not a callous psychopath. You really do want the person to be helped. So the best situation of all is if someone else helps. The worst situation is if no one helps. In between is if you help. So given that, everyone wants someone else to be the person who steps in. And you can actually there's a little bit of math as to what a person should do in that circumstance. And the answer is kind of roll mental dice and step in with a certain probability that depends on the risk that it would involve and the benefit of helping that person. It's what's called an outguessing standoff, a situation in game theory which is familiar in other circumstances, such as say a soccer player taking a penalty kick and a goalie, where the goalie has to guess whether the kicker will kick left or right. The kicker has to guess whether the goalie will guard left or right, each one trying to get inside the head of the other. And it's also a little bit like the old story of Who Will Bell the Cat, where the mice in a household are in mortal danger of being eaten by the cat, and suddenly it occurs to them that if the cat were wearing a bell, it would notify the mice to its approach, and they could all scurry away. And so they agree that someone has to hang the bell around the cat while it's sleeping. But of course, the mouse that volunteers for the benefit of the horde incurs some risk of being eaten if the cat wakes up. And so none of them bell the cat, and the title of the story is Who Will Bell the Cat? So that's the situation, and we did some studies where we had people imagine themselves in circumstances of helping and showed that it actually does follow the predictions of the game theory model. Still more questions. Your book has made the idea of common knowledge common knowledge. Well, that would be nice if it were true. How do you think that positively affects the readers? Does the knowledge of common knowledge lead to a higher ground general consciousness, in your opinion? Well, I kind of hope so. I hope that it will give people an understanding of some of the hidden logic behind the rituals, the hypocrisies, the euphemisms of everyday life, and how things that might appear to be completely irrational have a kind of logic to them. It doesn't offer concrete advice as to what to do, whether to make private knowledge common, but it does indicate that, for example, the idea of radical honesty, that everyone should blurt out everything all the time, is missing something crucial. And there is such a movement. It was figured in an episode of the comedy series Silicon Valley. It was the basis for the culture at the world's largest hedge fund, Bridgewater Associates, thanks to the theories of their founder and guru, Ray Dalio. But I end the book with an analysis of what the chapter title is, Rational Hypocrisy, Radical Honesty, and so why radical honesty is not the best policy. The movie Liar, Liar, which I showed a still from, would be an example of how that plays out. But I'll give you a couple of real-life examples. So it's known that a lot of people have illicit fantasies. There are surveys of people's sexual fantasies, and not everyone is faithful to their spouse in the privacy of their imagination, including Jimmy Carter, who in a famous episode that nearly cost him the presidency, confessed to an interviewer that he, quote, I've committed adultery in my heart many times. I have lusted in my heart. Now, Carter meant this as an expression of humility, namely, he did not, since Jesus taught that anyone who does something in his heart is as guilty as someone who commits it in reality, he did not feel superior to anyone else. This was a confession of humility. That's not the way it was interpreted. And even though he was probably one of our more monogamous presidents, he had a completely unfair reputation for concupiscence, and his lead in the polls went down by 20 points overnight. But it's an example of how, likewise, in a couple, in a lot of couples, each member probably has had fantasies of adulterous sex. If either of them gave a few minutes thought to it, they would know that the other person had thoughts of adulterous sex. Still, it's probably not a great idea to actually voice that publicly, even though each knows that the other knows, but blurting it out makes it that each knows that the other knows that the other one knows the other one knows, and that can threaten a relationship. Likewise, at the international scale, I'll give you a example where I'll give a couple of examples where hypocrisy is a really, really, really good policy. One of them is that Israel's policy as to whether it has nuclear weapons. It won't say. It will neither confirm nor deny. Now, everyone knows that Israel has nuclear weapons. If people didn't know it, it would not be a deterrent. There'd be no point in having it. So why don't they just say it? Well, the reason is obvious. If they were to say it, then it would be a kind of affront to their Arab rivals, to Egypt, to Saudi Arabia, which might be impelled to get their own nuclear weapons so as not to be publicly outmatched or humiliated by keeping the strategic ambiguity, one could say a kind of hypocrisy, then that's actually better than if it became an implicit challenge to status or dominance or prestige or dignity or reputation. Another example is of public hypocrisy that for which we should be thankful is that the country of Taiwan. Now, Taiwan is obviously a sovereign state. It's got its currency, it's got a capital, it's got borders, it's got a government, and so on. The official policy of the United States is it doesn't exist, that the People's Republic of China has control over all of historic China. So Taiwan does not have a seat in the United Nations. It does not have an embassy. That's a case of hypocrisy because obviously Taiwan is a country. But if the U.S., likewise the EU and any other country, were to publicly announce that they extended diplomatic relations to Taiwan, that would serve as a kind of insult and affront to People's Republic of China, which has staked its preeminence on ruling all of historic China. It could even provoke a war, which could escalate into a world war. So from couples to the world stage, sometimes hypocrisy is a good thing. I'll mention one other example that, again, it's not so much guidance as to how you should behave, but just gives you a little bit of insight as to how the world works and maybe allows us to think twice before changing it in a radically without a full appreciation of what's going on, which is often not totally obvious. So often law enforcement chooses to, as we say, look the other way. A alcoholic drinking from a whiskey bottle in a paper bag. Now, he's not fooling anyone, but why don't the police arrest him in the same way that they would arrest him if he was just drinking out of a bottle in plain sight? There are many stores that sell smoking paraphernalia. That's what they say, even though it is pretty obvious that they are that these are intended for drug users. There's a whole industry called escort services, and they're not just escort services. Why don't the police crack down on them? And so this is another case of hypocrisy. And maybe they should, but the reason they don't is that presumably it might be too oppressive, a waste of limited resources to go after what might be seen as low-level crimes. But when the perpetrators at least pretend that they're not flouting the law, it indicates that the law still holds. That is, that the police, the judiciary, the government has not forfeited the very idea that there are laws, which would be true if people did it openly and there were no consequences. If they make the pretense, if there's the fig leaf that there's no crime, there's the possible benefits of conserving police resources without surrendering the entire claim that the laws enforce. I'll give you one other example from everyday life, again from Thomas Schelling. Small children, when they're misbehaving, will sometimes avoid catching their parents' eye. Because if they, as showing, by the way, that a sensitivity to common knowledge appears early in life, and I mentioned that eye contact is a potent common knowledge generator, a child who was continuing to misbehave after meeting their parents' gaze would be doing two bad things, misbehaving and defying their parents, whereas if they didn't catch their parents' glance, they would just be misbehaving, sort of similar to the hypocrisies on other scales. Sorry, these are... one more, okay. Let's see something. Let's see if I can find something completely different. Okay, do you have any opinions on effective altruism? So this is relevant to Maimonides, because for the most part, Maimonides was not an effective altruist. That is, an effective altruism, this is a philosophy of mainly of philanthropy, but also of life choices, influenced by the philosophical doctrine of utilitarianism, which is that the moral worth of an action depends on how much people are helped, how much they benefit. Now, almost by definition, Maimonides' ladder is not effective altruism, other than the top rung, that is, teaching someone a trade or obviating the need for charity, because all the rest, the actual gift is constant. All that differentiates the rungs is who knows what. And an effective altruist would say, what difference does it make if a hungry person is fed? Who cares about how much reputational benefit the donor has? And by the way, we did in the studies that I talked about. One of them we did is we asked people to take the point of view of the beneficiary and ask what they preferred: a generous donor who got lots of reputational benefit, or an anonymous stingy donor. And even though third-party judges with no skin in the game esteem the anonymous donor more, if you then imagine yourself in the shoes of the beneficiary, reputation be damned, you prefer the bigger gift. But to give Maimonides his due, he did mention in discussing one of the wrongs that when it came to a charity, it is essential to know that the charity is follows good practices, doesn't waste the money, ensures that the donation go to the beneficiary. So he had a bit of effective altruism, even though most of the definition of righteousness was the opposite of effective altruism. So there is a movement. It's inspired by the philosopher Peter Singer, who noted that we would consider it monstrous to walk by a drowning child and not pull him out of the water because, say, we didn't want our expensive shoes to get damaged by it. But we do the same thing, Singer argued, when we consume money for our own luxuries that could have been spent on charity that would save the life of a child halfway across the world. The difference between a child in our presence and a child halfway around the world has no moral import at all, and that there's an obligation to donate as much as we can afford to effective charities, effective being they really do save lives, and to do research on which charity makes our dollar do the most good. Something that, again, to give Maimonides his due, he agreed with that part. So I think this is I support this movement, and they also have some counterintuitive recommendations. If your ultimate goal is to help people, to cure the sick, to feed the hungry, then, for example, celebrities who ostentatiously volunteer to be in a soup kitchen, to serve soup in a soup kitchen one day a week. Again, they get lots of glory, but they'd actually help a lot more people if they just donated money to hire lots and lots of restaurant workers in soup kitchens, and more homeless people would get soup. Now, what has happened to the effective altruism movement, sadly, is that it got, first of all, associated with Sam Bankman-Fried, who, by the way, that Larry David ad, "Don't be like Larry, don't miss out," it was an ad for FTX, the cryptocurrency exchange that Sam Bankman-Fried founded. He was kind of the public face of effective altruism. He said that the most moral thing you could do is make a lot of money so that you could give it to effective causes. Turns out that was something of a cynical front, and that he even confessed. I just said that for the virtue signaling. I don't really mean it. But he took down the reputation of effective altruism because of doing that. Another problem is these tend to be very smart people, sometimes too smart by half. That sometimes the people in the effective altruism movement, the theoreticians, kind of flaunt their ability to think of outlandish scenarios that might result in more lives being saved and come to somewhat preposterous conclusions. In particular, the direction that it's taken, sometimes called long-termism, where they say, well, if we're counting up the number of people who would benefit versus be harmed by our actions, since there is a potential future in which we might colonize the galaxy, there might be trillions of humans all enjoying life, maybe there'll even be the consciousnesses of even more uploaded to the cloud, all of them experiencing pleasure. The greatest moral imperative is to prevent the extinction of the species. Since runaway AI could lead to the extinction of the species, we should spend all our time figuring out how to prevent AI from becoming dangerous, even if it meant allowing people to kids to die of malaria and of river blindness, and even climate change isn't going to be as bad as AI taking over. Therefore, the most effective thing you could do is pay physicists and computer scientists to think about AI safety. So that's an example of what I consider to be kind of a wrong turn of the effective altruism movement, and it's one of the reasons that I have my misgivings of the directions that it's taken. Thanks very much.